I was first thinking that the double slit experiment was actually performed back in the 1920s when they talked about it. But what they could do at that time is just send particles one at a time through two slits and see that they got an interference pattern. That they were able to do. So they knew the effect, but they weren't able to collect which way data. That's the hard part. So you see, they did know that something magical happened because particles supposed to travel in straight lines. They're not supposed to magically distribute themselves into interference patterns. And that was a really big deal. And from that, they determined that our reality was not physical because physical things don't act like that. Physical things travel in straight lines unless acted on by external forces, and they just pile up behind a slit. That's what they do. So obviously, these particles weren't physical because physical things don't work that way. So what were they? And their studies showed them that it was probability. They came to the conclusion that our reality was probability based. And that's what then led them to the idea that consciousness was involved, had something to do with consciousness. So it got there through that channel, not because they actually measured which way data and did that experiment. That didn't happen till much later.
So they knew the observer was the key.
They knew that the observer was the key. Now, here's how they knew the observer was the key. All right, you have the fundamental reality is in probability. But when you observe it, you don't get a probability, you get an answer. That means that the observer makes that probability collapse into a fact in this reality, you see. So that's where the observer effect came from. It takes a person to look, and then the fact comes out. But if nobody looks, it stays probability. So that was the observer effect. Life happened because people made measurements. When you make the measurement, you get a result, a physical result. But until you make the measurement, there is no physical result. There's only probability. And that's true whether a human makes the measurement or I guess whether a dog makes a measurement. You know, when anybody does something to get a physical result, then the system will produce that physical result by taking a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities, right? That's what happens. So right when some being, some conscious being says, all right, I'm making a measurement. What's under this rock? Well, they pick up a rock and they look under it. And right as they look under it, the system has to download to them the answer. What's under that rock? Dirt, another stone, pebbles, a coin. What's under the rock? Well, it looks at the probability. What's the highest probability? Probably dirt. That's all. Maybe a centipede, maybe a worm. So it goes into those probabilities, and that is what it produces, drawn out of probabilities. That's the nature of our reality. And you don't get that until a measurement's made. A measurement can only be made by consciousness. Rocks don't make measurements. People make measurements, you see. So if you have a conscious entity, they can make a measurement and get an answer. So that's what brought consciousness in. Reality was shown to be probability. It didn't exist in a physical state. It only existed in a probability state. But when a consciousness comes up and says, all right, what's going to happen here? How are these electrons going to hit this screen? I'm going to stick a screen up here, and these photons, I mean, they come through the slits. They're going to hit that screen one way or another. They're going to pile up in a pile. They're going to do something. All right. Every time one of those little photons gets ready to hit the screen, a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibility is taken. It says, the probability says it's there. Probability says it's there. The probability says it's there. And after 1,000 of those come through with all those dots, you get an interference pattern. Why? because not to get an interference pattern would have caused a direct, what should we call it, conflict with science that had been around for 100 years called optics. Because when you put waves through a double slit, you get an interference pattern. So light was a wave. Now we find out that light, from the photoelectric effect, Einstein, I think, got a Nobel Prize for that. Found out that light really carried little chunks of momenta, which means it was a particle. All right, then they said, well, let's just put one particle at a time through and see what they do, because we know particles have to travel in straight lines. And what they found out is, if that was the case, there would have been a conflict, because you see, if you send one at a time through or hundreds at a time through, makes no difference. You have to get the same thing. Those photons do not interact with each other. So even if there's a billion of them going through that slit at a time, they're totally non-interactive. It's not like they talk to each other, make friends, bump into each other, anything like that. They're all totally independent. Well, if they're all totally independent, then whether a million go through or one goes through, you're going to get the same result because they're all independent. It's just whether they go through now or later doesn't make any difference. That's what you're going to get. So the system didn't want to allow this conflict in science, that you had optics said one thing, and then when you let these go one at a time, which should have given you the exact same answer, and it doesn't. There was a conflict there. Oh, we found a hole in reality. There's a conflict. We got two things we've done that must have the same answer, but they don't. Well, rather than have that kind of a conflict in the reality, because the system likes this reality to stay nice and smooth and believable, so it said, well, okay, I will give it a probability pattern that looks just like the interference pattern. So then it goes up out of that interference pattern probability, takes a random draw, gets a dot, takes another random draw, gets a dot, and eventually that probability pattern is what you see on the screen. And that probability pattern is exactly the same as for optics with waves. Now, there's no conflict. There's no logical discontinuity in the reality. So that's why the system made that choice. See, the system, I've said it this way before, it's like you put the larger conscious system between a rock and a hard place. You made it have to come up with something. Either it was going to give you a logical inconsistency in the reality, or it was going to have to come up with a new trick. Well, it came up with a new trick, and that was these particles were located by that random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities. That was made to be exactly the same as the result that you get with waves in optics. That way, no logical conflict in science. And the reason is the logical conflict, I said, is because all the particles are independent. So whether they're one at a time or a million at a time, they should do exactly the same thing. They're all independent. There's no interactions. So you see, that was the problem. So the scientists looked at that and they said, okay, the only way this can happen is that reality is probable. And when you look, when you make a measurement, now making the measurement was putting a screen up, and the particles had to hit the screen. Well, when they hit the screen, they left a dot. In the old days, that was film. Light hits a film, leaves a dot. You see, so it's a piece of film. So when light hit it, it made a little dot, and so on. And you added all the dots up, and you ended up with an interference pattern, just like the pattern you got when they thought they were waves. No logical inconsistency. Okay, you put the larger conscious system between a rock and a hard place, and what it chose was no logical inconsistency in the virtual reality, but now there's a mystery that wasn't there before. So no logical inconsistency, but a mystery is, why did those photons, for no particular reason, without any exterior forces, just arrange themselves in an interference pattern? Big mystery. You see, so that's kind of the mystery of quantum mechanics. That makes it weird physics, right? Weird science. So that's where all that comes from. So the observer effect was the fact that until it's observed, there is no reality. It's not in our reality until it's observed. And when we make the observation or the measurement, putting up a screen for the photon to make a dot on, that's a measurement. You see? So we force it to a physical answer. And when we force it to a physical answer, then we get this random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities, because reality is basically a virtual reality. It's probability based. So that was their thoughts. And because then reality was basically created by taking measurements, by observing. Every time we look with our eyes, we're taking measurements. Every time we hear something, that's a measurement. Feel something, taste something, smell something, that's a measurement. All of our sense data is constantly taking measurements. And as we take measurements, we cause things to happen. Reality is a certain way. And how is it? It's according to the rule set. This is a virtual reality. So you'll get a result. And in that particular result, with the double slit, where we put the system between a rock and a hard place, was it had two conflicting sets of data there. And it wasn't clear how that would work out, but the system made a choice. It could have made the choice, okay, I'll just leave a logical inconsistency in the reality. It could have done that. Or it chose rather to let those particles arrange themselves in a pattern that was outside of the ability of material particles to do. Big hint to us, right, that this wasn't a material reality. This is not physicalism here. This is something else. This is probability. You see? So the system gave us a really big hint there that this is not a physical reality.